In the last week of May, 1887, a woman knelt in the dirt along the north wall of a log cabin in Beaverhead County, Montana Territory, pressing sunflower seeds into the earth with her bare hands. She worked close to the foundation, so close that the shallow trench she had scraped ran within 3 inches of the logs themselves. The soil was hard compacted by 2 winters of freeze, loosened only by the thin melt of spring, resistant to everything except deliberate force. She used her fingers, not a trowel. She pushed each seed into the ground with the pad of her thumb, one after another, spacing them no more than 4 inches apart, moving along the base of the wall with the patient rhythm of someone performing a task she had performed before, in another place, in another life, with hands that had been younger but no less certain. Her name was Nora Whitfield. She was 34 years old. She had arrived in the Beaverhead Valley 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1884, driving a loaded wagon with a 7-year-old daughter beside her on the bench seat. The daughter's name was Bess. The wagon carried everything they owned: a cast-iron stove, a trunk of clothing seed stock tools, 2 bolts of canvas, a rifle that had belonged to Nora's husband Thomas, who was by then 11 months dead from a falling timber at a logging operation in the Gallatin Valley. The coroner's report, which Nora had folded into the family Bible without reading more than once, described the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting from the uncontrolled descent of a lodgepole pine during a milling operation on October 14, 1883. Thomas Whitfield was 31 years old when the tree killed him. Bess was 6. Nora was 30. She did not collapse. She did not return to Kansas, where her mother still lived. She did not seek shelter with relatives or churches or any of the charitable organizations that existed in the territory for the purpose of collecting women whose husbands had been subtracted from their lives by the routine violence of frontier industry. She sold Thomas's share of the logging claim for $40, bought provisions, loaded the wagon, drove north into the Beaverhead Valley with a child who had stopped asking where her father was, but had not yet stopped expecting him to appear, located a quarter section with water access along a creek that fed into the Beaverhead River, filed her claim at the land office in Dillon, built a cabin with lumber. She traded labor to acquire, survived her first winter on stockpiled venison, along with root vegetables she had buried in a pit cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin. By the spring of 1885, she had been in the valley long enough to become a fact of the landscape rather than a curiosity passing through it. People noticed her the way people in small communities notice anything that deviates from the expected pattern. A woman alone with a child building a homestead without a husband was not unprecedented in Montana Territory in 1884, but it was unusual enough to generate the low, continuous hum of observation that passes for attention in places where neighbors are separated by hundreds of yards of open ground. They watched her from a distance that was geographical but also social, the kind of distance that permits judgment without requiring engagement. What they saw over the course of those first 2 years was competence. Nora Whitfield kept a clean property. Her fences were straight, her woodpile was orderly. Her daughter attended the Sunday school at the Methodist Church in Dillon with hairbrush dress-pressed shoes intact. These details mattered in a community that measured character primarily through the visible evidence of effort. Because in Beaverhead County, effort was the currency that purchased respect, survival being the commodity that respect was meant to guarantee. She earned that respect through 2 winters that tested every homesteader in the valley with the indifferent thoroughness of a force that does not distinguish between the prepared, the careless, or the unlucky. Her first winter, 1884 to 1885, was moderate by Montana standards, which meant that the temperature dropped below zero on 23 separate nights between November 1st through March 15th. The wind averaged 12 miles per hour from the northwest, with gusts reaching 40 during the 3 major storms that swept through in January. The snow accumulated to a depth of 2 feet on level ground, with drifts reaching 6 feet against north-facing structures. Nora survived it by doing exactly what every other homesteader in the valley did. She chinked her cabin walls with moss collected from the creek bank packed with clay she dug from a deposit a quarter-mile south of her property. She split firewood from the deadfall pine that littered the slopes above the valley floor, stacking it against the north wall of her cabin in cords that rose to the height of the window. She banked the foundation with earth, shoveling a continuous berm of soil around the base of the cabin to block the wind that crawled along the ground in winter, seeking every gap between log-bottom bare dirt. She sealed the door with a strip of canvas stuffed with dried grass. She kept the stove burning from October through April, feeding it with a disciplined regularity that treated fuel the way a careful accountant treats money, never burning more than what was needed, never letting the fire drop below the threshold that separated uncomfortable from dangerous. It worked. She survived. Bess survived. The cabin held. But the margin was narrow, narrower than Nora would have admitted to anyone who asked, which no one did. Because in Beaverhead County, you did not ask a neighbor how close they had come to failing. You simply observed whether they were still present in the spring, drew your conclusions from the fact of their continued existence. Move forward into the short summer with the shared understanding that winter had tested everyone equally, while sparing no one the private knowledge of exactly how thin the line had been. The second winter was worse. The winter of 1885 to 1886 arrived 3 weeks early with a November storm that dropped the temperature to 14 below zero on the night of November 9th. Nora's chinking, which had held through the moderate first winter, cracked in 7 places along the north wall, where the clay had dried too quickly during the autumn heat, leaving gaps that were invisible in October but became channels for the killing wind once the temperature dropped below the threshold at which air stops being. Air starts becoming a weapon. She patched the gaps with fresh moss, but the moss froze before it bonded with the clay, creating a seal that looked solid from inside the cabin but offered the structural integrity of paper. The wind found the weakness within hours. It always found the weakness. That was what wind did in Montana in winter. It searched. By January, Nora was burning firewood at a rate that her autumn calculations had not anticipated. The stove consumed fuel the way a starving animal consumes food relentlessly without satisfaction, each load of pine disappearing into heat that the walls surrendered almost as fast as the stove produced it. She could feel the cabin bleeding warmth. She could lay her hand against the interior surface of the north wall at midnight, with the stove fully loaded burning at its maximum output. Feel the cold pressing through the logs like something alive. Something patient, something that understood it had more time than she had fuel. By early February, her woodpile was down to half a cord. Half a cord would last 2 weeks at the rate she was burning, possibly 3, if she reduced the fire to survival minimum, which meant keeping the interior temperature at a level that would prevent the water bucket from freezing solid, but would not prevent Bess from shivering continuously through the night, her small body curled tight under every blanket. Nora owned her breath visible in the lamplight, her feet so cold that Nora would pull them against her own stomach beneath the quilts to transfer what warmth she could from her own body to her daughter's extremities. One night in the second week of February, with the temperature outside at 22 below zero, the wind a steady 20 miles per hour from the northwest, the stove burning through its load of pine with a hissing urgency that sounded almost desperate, Bess developed a fever. It was not a high fever. It was the low, persistent fever of a body that has been cold for too long. A body whose immune system has been worn down, not by a specific pathogen, but by the cumulative drain of weeks spent in a room that never quite reached the temperature at which human physiology operates without strain. Nora held her daughter through the night, felt the heat radiating from the girl's forehead, while the rest of her body shook with chills that the fever could not override. Listened to the wind outside the north wall, the wall that was failing. The wall that was supposed to be the boundary between her family's survival, along with the force that was trying to end it. She heard her mother's voice that night. Not a hallucination, not a mystical experience, not the kind of visitation that grief or exhaustion sometimes manufactures from the raw material of memory. She simply heard in the quiet space between the gusts of wind the particular cadence of her mother's voice, saying something her mother had said to her many times during the winters of her childhood in Kansas, something so ordinary, so embedded in the texture of daily life on the Pratt homestead in Harvey County, that Nora had carried it for years without ever examining it, the way a person examines a tool that has always been on the shelf but has never been needed. Don't fight the wind, make the wind forget the wall. Helen Pratt had not been a philosopher. She had been a farm woman in central Kansas with rough hands, a practical mind, a vocabulary that rarely exceeded the demands of daily speech. When she spoke about wind forgetting walls, she was not constructing a metaphor. She was describing in the compressed language of a woman who had learned something useful from her neighbors, a specific technique for protecting structures from heat loss during winter storms. A technique she had learned from the Mennonite families who had settled the quarter section adjacent to the Pratt homestead in the early 1870s. The technique involved sunflowers. Not the flowers themselves, not the bright, heavy heads that turned through the day to follow the sun, but the stalks, the thick, woody stems that remained after the flowers died in autumn. dried to the color of old bone. Hollow, fibrous, surprisingly rigid, capable of being gathered bundled, pressed against the walls of a structure in a dense mat that served a purpose no one in the Beaverhead Valley had ever considered. Nora lay in the dark with Bess's feverish body against her chest. Listened to the wind tearing at the north wall, remembered her mother's hands bundling dried sunflower stalks against the walls of the root cellar in Kansas. Remembered the particular sound the wind made when it hit that layer of dead vegetation. A sound that was different from the sound the wind made against bare wood, softer, more diffuse. As if the wind had been broken into pieces before it could gather the force necessary to strip warmth from the surface it was trying to reach. She remembered the root cellar staying dry inside when every other structure on the property wept with condensation. She remembered her mother explaining in the plain language of a woman who did not know the science behind what she was describing, but knew the result that the stalks kept the cold from finding the wall. By morning, Bess's fever had broken. The winter eventually ended. Spring came to the Beaverhead Valley in late March, with the abruptness that characterized all seasonal transitions in that part of Montana, as if someone had thrown a switch that converted the landscape from white to brown overnight. Nora emerged from the cabin with her daughter, her depleted woodpile, her cracked chinking, her intimate knowledge of every weakness in every wall, every gap where the wind had entered, every surface where the cold had pressed through the logs with a persistence that no amount of interior fuel could overcome. She spent that summer, the summer of 1886, doing what every homesteader did. She rechinked. She split firewood. She repaired, reinforced, prepared. But she also began thinking about something none of her neighbors were thinking about, because none of her neighbors had grown up on a homestead in Harvey County, Kansas, next to a community of Mennonite farmers who understood that the most effective barrier against cold was not a thicker wall, but a layer of still air held against the wall's outer surface by a material that cost nothing except the time it took to grow. By the following May, she was back on the ground along the north wall, working the same soil she had walked across for 3 winters, but with a different purpose, now scraping a shallow trench that followed the base of the cabin the way a shadow follows its source. She planted the north wall first, because the north wall took the worst of the winter wind, because the north wall was where the chinking always failed first. Because the north wall was the wall she had pressed her hand against at midnight in February, while her daughter shivered with fever in the bed behind her. She planted the east wall next, then the south, then the west. 4 unbroken rows of sunflower seeds running around the cabin like a border drawn in soil, a perimeter that followed the outline of the structure with the precision of someone who understood that gaps in the planting would become gaps in the protection. That every inch of exposed wall would be an inch of wall the wind could find when the wind came looking. She finished the planting in 2 days. She did not explain what she was doing to anyone, not because she was secretive by nature, but because the explanation would have required her to describe a system that her neighbors had no framework for. Understanding, a system that began with a Mennonite root cellar in Kansas, passed through her mother's hands, lived in her own muscle memory, existed as practice rather than theory, knowledge rather than argument. She could not have explained it in terms that would have satisfied the men who gathered at the mill on Saturday mornings to discuss the practical matters of homesteading, because the explanation was not an argument. It was a demonstration that had not yet been demonstrated. So she planted, said nothing, waited for the seeds to grow, waited for the growing to become the dying, waited for the dying to become the material, waited for the material to become the wall, waited for the wall to meet the wind, waited for the only proof that mattered, which was winter itself. Harlan Bryce saw her planting on the afternoon of the second day. He was standing in his own field 200 yards to the west on the other side of the fence line that separated his wheat acreage from Nora's quarter section. Harlan was 45 years old, built with the dense, compacted musculature of a man who had spent 11 years breaking ground in a valley where the soil fought back against every plow, every shovel, every post hole. He had arrived in Beaverhead County in 1876. A year before Nora was born, had built 3 cabins with his own hands. During that time, the first a single-room structure that he abandoned after 2 winters, because the logs were too green, the chinking would not hold the whole building, settling unevenly on a foundation he had not prepared with sufficient care. The second cabin, larger, better constructed, built with logs he had seasoned for a full year before assembly, served him through 6 winters before he outgrew it after his marriage to Ruth in 1881. The third, the cabin he currently occupied with Ruth, their 14-year-old son Edgar, their 11-year-old daughter Mary, was the culmination of everything Harlan knew about building a structure that could withstand the specific, relentless, annually recurring assault of a Montana winter. He knew wood. He knew it the way a surgeon knows tissue from the inside, with an intimacy that came not from study, but from sustained physical contact, from years of splitting, stacking, joining, chinking, repairing. He could look at a log wall, read the grain of the wood, identify the species estimate, the moisture content, predict where the first crack would appear, calculate within reasonable accuracy how many winters the chinking would hold before it needed to be replaced. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was the accumulated residue of 11 years of arguing with wood about whether it would keep his family alive through another December, another January, another February. The wood winning some of those arguments, Harlan, winning others, the ongoing negotiation, producing a kind of expertise that could not be taught in a classroom, could not be extracted from a book, could only be earned through the specific experience of waking up on a January morning to discover that the wall you had built with your own hands was letting the cold through a gap you had not seen, had not predicted, had not believed was possible, given the care you had taken during the previous autumn. He stood at the fence line with his hands pushed into the pockets of his coat, his hat tipped back on his head, watching Nora Whitfield press seeds into the dirt along the base of her cabin wall. He watched for several minutes without speaking because there was nothing immediately obvious to say. A woman planting seeds was not remarkable. A woman planting seeds against the wall of her cabin within inches of the foundation, on the north side where no garden plant would receive adequate sunlight and soil, that was compacted by years of foot traffic around the perimeter of the structure, that was something that required a question. He walked to the fence. His boots left impressions in the soft spring ground that would dry into permanent marks by June. He called across to her, his voice carrying easily, in the clear, still air of a Montana afternoon in late May. When the wind drops, the sky opens into a blue, so deep it seems architectural. The valley lies quiet between the mountains like a held breath. Nora, what are the sunflowers for? She looked up from the dirt. Her hands were black to the wrists, the soil packed under her fingernails pressed into the lines of her palms. She had the stillness about her that people in the valley had learned not to mistake for timidity. It was not shyness. It was the composure of a woman who had made her decisions before the conversation began, who was not seeking input, approval, collaboration, or the kind of neighborly consensus that governed most activity in the valley. She looked at Harlan across the fence with an expression that was neither hostile nor inviting. It was simply present, the face of a person who had been asked a question she had anticipated, had considered, had decided in advance how to answer. For the cabin. 3 words. Harlan waited for more, the way a man waits for the rest of a sentence that has been interrupted. His body tilted slightly forward, his weight on the fence post, his face arranged in the receptive expression of someone who assumes that additional information is coming, because 3 words cannot possibly constitute a complete answer to a question about why a woman is pressing sunflower seeds into the dirt against the walls of her home. Nothing more came. Nora returned her attention to the ground, her thumb pressing another seed into the trench with a deliberateness that communicated more clearly than any additional words could have that the conversation was over. Harlan stepped back from the fence. He walked back to his own work, carrying with him the faint unease of a man who has encountered something he cannot categorize, something that does not fit into the established taxonomy of rational behavior that 11 years of survival in the Beaverhead Valley had constructed in his mind. Sunflowers against a cabin wall. For the cabin. He turned the phrase over as he walked, examining it, the way a man examines a coin he suspects might be counterfeit, looking for the detail that would reveal whether it was genuine currency or worthless metal shaped to deceive. Within 2 weeks, the story had traveled through the valley with the velocity that all stories achieve in communities where the distance between neighbors is measured in hundreds of yards, but the distance between pieces of gossip is measured in hours. Nora Whitfield was growing sunflowers against her cabin. Not near her cabin, which would have been merely unusual, a garden decision that could be attributed to aesthetic preference or limited space. Against her cabin, pressed tight to the logs, so close that the growing stalks would eventually lean against the wood. The leaves would lay flat against the chinking. The entire structure would be enveloped in a living wall of vegetation that served no purpose anyone in the valley could identify. The telling always emphasized that distinction, not near against, because it was the detail that transformed an odd preference into something genuinely baffling. A woman who grew flowers in a garden was a woman who liked flowers. A woman who grew them pressed flat against the walls of her home, deliberately, methodically on every side, was a woman doing something that demanded explanation. No explanation had been offered. Harlan Bryce became the primary narrator of the story by default, having been the only person who had asked Nora directly received the three-word answer that was not an answer, walked away carrying the unsatisfied curiosity that now fueled every retelling. He told it at the Dillon Trading Post while waiting for his supply order. He told it to the men who gathered at the mill on Saturday mornings, their hands wrapped around tin cups of coffee that had been brewed in a pot that had not been properly cleaned since the previous autumn. He told it to his wife Ruth, who told it at the church social the following Sunday, where it multiplied among the women the way all stories multiply when they pass from a man's telling, which tends toward the factual, into a woman's telling, which tends toward the interpretive. In every version, Harlan was careful to establish that he bore no ill will toward Nora Whitfield. She was capable. She kept a clean property. Her daughter was fed, clothed, mannered. These qualifications were not charity. They were necessary context because in Beaverhead County, to question a neighbor's methods without first acknowledging their character was to cross a line that could not be easily uncrossed. The valley was too small, the winters too dangerous, the interdependence too real for any criticism to be delivered without the cushion of respect that preceded it. But the sunflowers were a waste of effort. That was the conclusion that followed every telling delivered not as opinion, but as arithmetic. In Beaverhead County, every hour of summer labor either prepared you for winter or it did not. There was no third category. The hours Nora spent planting, watering, tending sunflower seeds along the walls of her cabin were hours she could have spent splitting firewood, rechinking, reinforcing the foundation, repairing the roof, performing any of the dozens of tasks that stood between a homesteader's family, the killing potential of a Montana January. The sunflowers consumed effort that could have been converted into warmth. They were, by the simple math that governed frontier survival, a debt that winter would collect. The name arrived with the effortless inevitability that characterizes all nicknames born from communal observation. Someone, Harlan thought, it might have been the Kemp boy, the teenager who delivered firewood to homesteads that lacked sufficient timber on their own claims, called it the flower cabin. The name stuck because it captured in two words the precise absurdity that the community felt. A cabin was not a thing you decorated. A cabin was a tool for surviving winter. You maintained it the way you maintained any tool with function, governing every decision, every modification, every hour of labor invested in its upkeep. You chinked the gaps, you banked the foundation, you stacked firewood against the north wall to break the wind. These were rational actions taken by rational people against a threat that killed without prejudice, without warning, without the kind of negotiation that might allow a person to substitute decoration for defense. You did not plant flowers. Nora heard the name. In a valley that small where the trading post, the church, the mill, formed the 3 points of a triangle that enclosed every conversation worth having, she could not have avoided hearing it. She heard it from the Kemp boy himself, who mentioned it without malice, while unloading a half-cord of pine at her property in early June, his young face displaying the open, uncomplicated expression of someone who does not realize he is delivering information that could wound. She heard it from the way Mrs. Allinger paused just slightly before greeting her at the trading post. The pause containing the particular quality of a person who has recently been talking about you, has not quite finished the conversation in her own mind. Needs a fraction of a second to transition from the version of you that exists in gossip to the version of you that is standing in front of her, holding a sack of flour. She heard it. She continued planting. By the second week of June, the shoots had broken through the soil along all four walls, a thin green fringe running around the base of the cabin like stitching pulled too tight. The shoots were unremarkable at this stage, indistinguishable from any other seedling pushing through Montana dirt. In early summer, fragile, tentative, leaning slightly toward whatever light the cabin walls did not block. But they were growing. They were growing with the silent, relentless determination that sunflowers bring to the act of reaching upward, a determination that is botanical rather than metaphorical, rooted in the specific genetic programming of a plant that has evolved to grow fast, grow tall, grow toward the sun, with a single-mindedness that other plants distribute among branches, leaves lateral growth. By late June, the stalks were a foot high. By mid-July, they were 3 feet. The green fringe had become a green wall dense enough to obscure the lower logs of the cabin, thick enough that a person walking along the perimeter would have had to push through vegetation to reach the door. Nora had left a gap at the door, a 3-foot break in the planting that allowed entry, but every other inch of the cabin's perimeter was occupied by sunflower stalks growing so close together that their leaves overlapped, creating a continuous surface of green that rustled in the wind with a sound like whispered conversation. Ruth Bryce, who had initially defended Nora at the church social with a gentle suggestion that perhaps the flowers were a widow's comfort, had by July abandoned that defense. The scale of the planting made comfort an insufficient explanation. A window box was comfort. A small garden near the door was comfort. 4 unbroken rows of sunflowers encircling an entire cabin, growing so dense that the structure was beginning to disappear behind them, was something else entirely. Ruth did not know what it was, but she knew it was not comfort. She knew it was not rational. She knew that her husband's assessment of wasted effort was probably correct. She knew that saying so publicly would align her with the majority opinion in a community where alignment with the majority was the safest position a woman could occupy. She said so publicly. At the July church social, when Mrs. Allinger asked whether anyone had seen the Whitfield cabin lately, Ruth shook her head with the slow, deliberate sadness of a woman expressing concern for a neighbor she could not help. Such a shame, she offered, because Nora was otherwise so sensible. The word otherwise contained the entire judgment of the community, compressed into a single qualifier that acknowledged Nora's competence while simultaneously excluding the sunflowers from the category of competent behavior. Otherwise sensible. The phrase traveled back to Nora through the same channels that had delivered the name Flower Cabin, arriving with the same gentle lethality of information that is not intended to harm but harms nonetheless. The way a river undermines a bank not through violence, but through the patient, continuous application of pressure that the bank cannot answer. Bess brought it home. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-July, Bess came through the door of the cabin with the specific expression that children wear when they have been wounded by other children, an expression composed of equal parts anger, confusion, hurt the anger, being the most visible because anger is the emotion that children learn earliest, to display the confusion being the deepest, because children do not yet understand that cruelty does not require malice, that the worst injuries are often inflicted by people who believe they are stating facts. The children at the church had called her a name, Wildflower Girl. They had told her that her mother was wasting the summer, that the sunflowers were foolish, that the cabin looked strange, that everyone's parents talked about it at home. Bess did not relay these details in a coherent narrative. She delivered them in fragments, the way a child delivers pain in bursts, separated by silences that are more eloquent than the words between them. Each fragment carrying a weight that the child does not fully understand, but feels with the totality that only children can bring to the experience of being excluded by their peers. Nora listened. She did not kneel down to meet Bess at eye level, which is what the parenting wisdom of a later century would have recommended. She stood at the stove where she had been heating water for washing her hands. Still her face, still her body, displaying the particular rigidity of a woman who is absorbing an impact she does not want her daughter to see her absorb. She let Bess finish. She told Bess to wash her face, change her dress, set the table for supper. Practical instructions delivered in a practical voice. The voice of a mother who understands that the most reassuring thing she can offer a wounded child is not sympathy, but normalcy. The steady continuation of routine that tells the child without words that the world has not changed, that the ground beneath them is still solid, that whatever happened outside this cabin does not govern what happens inside it. Bess washed her face. She changed her dress. She set the table. She ate supper. She went to bed. Nora sat with her until she slept, then Rose walked outside, stood on the porch in the long blue twilight of a Montana July evening, looked at the sunflowers. They were beautiful. She had not planted them for beauty, did not care about beauty, had no aesthetic investment in the tall green stalks that now rose above the windowsills. On every wall, their leaves broad, their stems thickening daily, their heads beginning to form the heavy disc-shaped structures that would eventually fill with seeds, turn to follow the sun, create the visual spectacle that was already drawing attention from people who passed on the road. The beauty was incidental. It was also, she understood in that moment, the problem. Because beauty was what people saw. Beauty was the category into which they placed the sunflowers, the only category available to them, the only explanation that fit their understanding of what a person does when they surround their home with flowers. Decoration, ornament, vanity, a waste of summer. The thing that was beautiful could not possibly be functional. That was the assumption so deep that no one in the valley had thought to question it. So fundamental that it operated not as a conscious belief, but as a perceptual filter determining what people were capable of seeing. When they looked at Nora's cabin, excluding from their vision everything that did not fit the established pattern of what flowers were for. She stood on the porch for a long time. She thought about Bess. She thought about the previous February, the fever, the cold, the north wall failing, the sound of wind coming through gaps in the chinking like a living thing searching for a way inside. She thought about her mother's voice. Don't fight the wind, make the wind forget the wall. She thought about the choice she was facing, which was not really a choice at all. Because on one side of the decision was the approval of a community that did not understand what she was building. On the other side was a warm cabin in January. Her daughter sleeping without fever. The north wall holding through the worst of the wind because the wind would never reach the wall. She went inside. She did not consider pulling up the sunflowers. The winter of Bess's fever had settled that question before the question was asked. By the end of July, the sunflowers had reached 5 feet. Harlan Bryce, who had been watching their progress with the particular attention of a man monitoring a situation he considers both harmless, foolish, could no longer see the lower half of Nora's cabin from his property. The green wall had risen above the windows. The stalks were thick as a man's thumb at the base, leaning against the logs with the slow, heavy pressure of living things seeking support. The leaves, broad enough to cover a dinner plate, lay flat against the chinking and overlapping layers that blocked the view of the logs beneath. On the last Saturday of July at the Dillon Trading Post, with 4 men from the valley standing within earshot, Harlan delivered his assessment of the situation with the calm specificity that characterized everything he said about wood-weather survival. He addressed Nora directly. He was not being cruel. He wanted to be clear about that, both to himself, to anyone who might later describe the conversation. He was offering the benefit of his experience, which was considerable, to a woman whose experience, while admirable in other respects, did not extend to the behavior of moisture against log walls over multiple seasons. The sunflowers were drawing moisture against the logs. He could see it from the road, the way the leaves lay flat against the wood, trapping dew, holding rain, creating a microenvironment of sustained dampness between the vegetation, the wall. Moisture against logs meant rot. Not immediately, not this season, perhaps not next season, but within 3 to 5 years. The fibers of the wood would soften, the chinking would fail permanently. The structural integrity of the wall would degrade from the outside in until the cabin was no longer a cabin, but a collection of rotting timber held together by habit, memory, insufficient nails. He delivered this assessment with his arms crossed, his voice level, his face displaying the neutral competence of a man who has diagnosed a problem, prescribed a solution, expects compliance. The solution was obvious. Pull the sunflowers before they did any more damage, stack firewood against the walls instead, which would provide the same windbreak with none of the moisture risk, which was the method that every homesteader in the valley used, which had been the standard practice since the first cabin was built in the Beaverhead Valley a generation ago. Nora listened. The men at the trading post listened. The silence that followed Harlan's assessment had the specific quality of a silence that is waiting for submission for the gracious acceptance of superior knowledge that social convention required from a person who had just been corrected by someone with more experience. Instead, Nora spoke. She spoke quietly, without defensiveness, without the heat that a less certain person might have brought to the moment. She described a detail that no one in the valley had noticed because no one had looked closely enough to notice it. She had not planted the sunflowers against the wall. She had planted them 2 inches from the wall. Between the growing stalks, the log surface, she had placed a layer of dried bark, strips of cottonwood bark collected from the creek, leaned against the logs at an angle that created a narrow channel, a gap through which air could move, carrying moisture away from the wood surface, even as the sunflower stalks blocked moisture from reaching it in quantity. 2 inches, a layer of bark, a channel for air. These were not the improvisations of a woman decorating her cabin. These were the calculated specifications of a system designed by someone who had thought about the relationship between vegetation, moisture, wood, with a precision that Harlan had not anticipated, because he had not imagined that precision was present. He blinked. He recovered. He drew a long breath through his nose, the way a man steadies himself when a thought he was certain of has been met with something he did not expect. 2 inches does not save wood from rot. He responded, his voice carrying the faint edge of a man whose authority has been challenged in front of witnesses. Not loudly, not aggressively, but challenged nonetheless. Wood will wick moisture through 2 inches of air. It always does. Nora did not argue. She picked up her flour, her coffee, her salt. She walked out of the trading post with the unhurried stride of a woman who has said what she intended to say, heard what she expected to hear, altered nothing in her plans based on either. Harlan watched her go. He turned to the men who remained, their faces wearing various expressions along the spectrum from amusement to mild discomfort that the exchange had produced. He repeated to no one in particular the assessment he had already delivered. Moisture against logs, rot within 5 years. Such a shame because she was otherwise sensible. The word otherwise again. Carrying the full weight of the valley's judgment, the gentle dismissal of a community that could not see what it had not been taught to look for. What none of them understood, what they could not have understood without the specific inheritance that Nora carried in her hands, her memory, her muscles, was that Harlan was right about Wood. He understood Wood better than anyone in the valley. His 11 years of building, repairing, fighting the annual war between timber weather had given him a knowledge of wood behavior that was genuinely expert, genuinely earned, genuinely reliable within the domain of his experience. He was right that moisture against logs produced rot. He was right that rot destroyed structural integrity. He was right that every fact he had cited about the behavior of water and wood grain over multiple freeze-thaw cycles was accurate, tested, proven by decades of observation in the specific climate of southwestern Montana. He was right about wood, he was wrong about the system, because he had never seen a system like the one Nora was building, had never imagined that such a system could exist, had no framework for understanding that the sunflowers were not decoration pressed against a wall, but the outermost component of an insulation method that addressed the problem of winter heat loss at a level his experience had never reached. He was looking at the surface of what Nora was doing, seeing flowers against wood, drawing the only conclusion his knowledge permitted. The deeper logic, the still air, the wind disruption, the thermal barrier created by tangled hollow stems, the principle that her mother had learned from a Mennonite woman in Kansas who had learned it from generations of practice on the cold grasslands of the Central Plains, existed beyond the horizon of his understanding, not because he was stupid, but because he had never been shown what lay beyond that horizon. He would be shown. The winter that was already building beyond the mountains to the north, gathering cold, gathering wind, gathering the specific combination of temperature, velocity, duration, that would turn the season from a test into a verdict, would show him. But that showing was still 6 months away, hidden behind the long, bright days of a Montana summer that felt as all Montana summers felt, as if it would last forever, as if winter were a theory rather than a certainty, as if the warmth of July could be trusted to persist through August, September, October, November, into the December that was coming for every cabin in the valley, every wall, every gap in every wall, every person behind every wall who believed that their preparation was sufficient because their preparation was the same preparation that everyone else had made. The sunflowers grew. The summer continued. Nora said nothing more about them to anyone. She had planted her answer in the dirt along the walls of her cabin, 4 rows of seeds pressed into hard Montana earth, carrying knowledge that had traveled from a Mennonite homestead in Kansas through her mother's hands into her own knowledge that lived in her muscles, rather than her arguments that would prove itself not through explanation, but through performance. Not through persuasion, but through the silence of a warm cabin in a cold wind. The valley watched. The valley named. The valley judged. The valley waited as all valleys wait for winter to settle every argument that summer had started. The knowledge that Nora carried in her hands had traveled a long road to reach Montana, though the road was not measured in miles so much as in generations, in the slow, patient transfer of practical understanding from one woman's fingers to another's, across years that did not preserve themselves in books or letters, but in the specific memory of muscles performing work that the mind had not yet been asked to justify. Her mother, Helen Pratt, was born Helen Crawford in 1830 in a sod house on the eastern edge of Harvey County, Kansas, the 4th child of a wheat farmer who had come west from Indiana with a plow, a Bible, a wife who would bear 7 children before the soil of Kansas wore her body down to the kind of thinness that precedes either recovery or surrender. Helen's mother chose neither. She simply continued the way women on the plains continued, by reducing the definition of survival to its smallest possible unit. One more day, one more season, one more harvest, until the accumulation of those units constituted something that could, from a sufficient distance, be mistaken for a life. Helen inherited that arithmetic. She grew up on a homestead where every resource was counted, every action measured against its contribution to the household's persistence. Through the next winter, the next drought, the next visitation of grasshoppers or hail, or any of the other instruments that the Kansas climate deployed against the ambitions of people who had decided to grow wheat in a place where the land had its own opinions about what should grow. She married at 20, a man named Orrin Pratt, a neighbor's son whose primary qualification as a husband was that he owned 40 acres adjacent to her father's claim, creating a combined property large enough to justify the labor of two families working in coordination. Love was not discussed. Compatibility was not assessed. The marriage was an economic merger conducted under religious auspices, producing 3 children in 4 years, the youngest of whom was a girl born in 1853, who was given the name Nora. The Mennonites arrived in Harvey County in 1874, the year Nora turned 21. They came from communities further east, families who had been farming the American plains for nearly a decade, bringing with them agricultural practices refined through generations of working harsh climates. They settled a large parcel of land adjacent to the Pratt homestead, a quarter section of grassland, that they converted within a single growing season into the most productive farm in the county. Their methods were different from anything Helen had seen. They planted crops in rotations that seemed arbitrary until you watched the soil respond with yields that neighboring farms could not match. They managed water with an efficiency that made the other homesteaders' irrigation look wasteful. They built structures, root cellars, animal shelters, grain storage buildings, using techniques that were unfamiliar to every other farmer in the area. Among those techniques was the sunflower. The Mennonites grew sunflowers the way other people grew timber, as a material, not an ornament. They planted them in dense rows along the borders of their fields. They pressed the seeds for oil that they used in cooking in lamps and the treatment of leather. They fed the stalks to livestock during winter when hay was scarce. They composted the leaves into a soil amendment that they worked into their garden plots each spring. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the plant served a purpose. Every purpose served the farm. Every function of the farm served the family's survival through the cycle of seasons that governed all life on the central Kansas plain. But the practice that caught Helen Pratt's attention, the practice that would travel from Kansas to Montana through a chain of hands that began with hers, was what the Mennonite women did with the dried sunflower stalks in autumn, after the seeds had been harvested, after the oil had been pressed, after the livestock had eaten what they would eat, after every productive use of the living plant had been exhausted. The women gathered what remained, the thick woody stems dried to a pale brown, hollow, stiff, light enough to carry in armloads but rigid enough to stand upright, when leaned against the surface, carried them to the walls of the root cellars, the animal shelters. In some cases, the houses themselves stacked them against the exterior surfaces in a dense band 3 to 4 feet deep, so thick that the structures vanished beneath the accumulated mass of dead vegetation. Helen noticed this practice in October of 1874 during her first autumn as a neighbor to the Mennonite settlement. She noticed it because noticing was what Helen did. She was not a curious woman in the intellectual sense, not a person who read books or asked abstract questions about the nature of things. She was curious in the practical sense, the sense that operates below conscious thought, the sense that registers deviation from the expected pattern. Files the observation away without analysis, retrieves it later when circumstances create a need that the observation can fill. She saw the Mennonite women carrying armloads of dried stalks to the walls of a root cellar. She saw the cellar disappear behind a mound of dead plant matter. She stored the image the way she stored all images, without commentary, without interpretation, with only the instinctive awareness that what she was seeing was deliberate. That deliberate action by competent people usually had a reason that the reason might someday matter. The reason came to her through Martha Yoder. Martha was a Mennonite woman approximately Helen's age, living on the adjacent claim with a husband, 4 children, a mother-in-law who spoke no English. Martha's English was limited but functional, built from the practical vocabulary of a woman who needed to communicate about weather crop prices, the shared fence line, the occasional stray animal that wandered from one property to the other. She was not Helen's friend in the social sense. The Mennonites kept to themselves, worshipped in their own congregation, maintained a separation from the surrounding community that was cultural rather than hostile, rooted in a tradition of distinctness that they carried with them from settlement to settlement the way other people carried furniture. But Martha spoke to Helen across the fence the way neighbors speak when proximity creates its own form of intimacy, the intimacy of shared weather, shared soil, shared vulnerability to the same threats that the Kansas climate delivered without discrimination. They talked about rain. They talked about the price of wheat at the Halstead Depot. They talked about the coyotes that were taking chickens from both properties with increasing boldness as the autumn progressed. In November of 1874, with the first hard freeze still a week away, but the signs of its approach visible in the morning frost that whitened the grass before sunrise, Helen walked the fence line inspecting a section of wire that a bull had damaged. She could see from the fence the Mennonite root cellar on Martha's property, its walls now completely hidden behind the mass of dried sunflower stalks that the women had been stacking for weeks. The structure looked abandoned, consumed, buried beneath dead vegetation. Helen stopped walking. She stood at the fence looking at the cellar the way a person looks at something they have been noticing without examining the accumulated observations of several weeks, suddenly coalescing into a question that she had not previously thought to ask. Martha was in her yard. Helen called to her. Martha walked to the fence. Helen pointed at the root cellar at the wall of dried stalks surrounding it. She asked why. Martha looked at the cellar, looked back at Helen, displayed the brief expression of a person who has been asked to explain something so fundamental to her experience that the question itself is surprising. She answered in her limited English, choosing words with the care of someone selecting tools from a kit that does not contain exactly the right implement for the job. The stalks keep the cold from finding the wall. 9 words. Helen received them the way she received all practical information without argument, without immediate comprehension, with only the quiet registration of a statement that sounded specific enough to be based on experience rather than superstition. She did not ask Martha to elaborate. She did not ask for the science behind the claim. She did not need to understand why the stalks kept the cold from finding the wall. She only needed to know whether they did. Nora was 21 that autumn. She had accompanied her mother on the walk along the fence line, had stood beside her during the exchange with Martha, had heard the 9 words that Martha spoke. She had also, in the weeks preceding, watched the Mennonite women perform the work of stacking the stalks. She had watched with the particular attention of a young woman who had grown up on a farm where observation was a survival skill rather than a pastime, where you watched what your neighbors did because your neighbors' methods might contain information that your own family's methods lacked information that could mean the difference between a winter that was merely hard, a winter that killed. She watched, stored the images, said nothing. She did not yet know that what she was watching would become the most important knowledge she would ever carry. Helen tested the claim that winter. She did not test it on her house because Orrin would not have permitted it, because Orrin's understanding of winter preparation was fixed, inherited from his father, resistant to modification, governed by the same principle that governed Harlan Bryce's methods 11 years later in Montana. You did what worked. You did what you had always done. You did not experiment with the survival of your family based on the advice of neighbors whose practices you did not fully understand. So Helen tested it on the chicken coop. She had 2 coops. Both were identical in construction, rough sawn boards nailed to a frame of cottonwood posts roofed with sod, large enough to house 15 chickens each. She stacked dried sunflower stalks against the walls of one coop 3 feet deep on every side, leaving only the door unobstructed. The other coop she left bare, protected by nothing except the boards themselves, exposed to whatever the winter of 1874 to 1875 chose to deliver. The winter delivered a blizzard in January that dropped the temperature to 18 below zero, with wind gusting above 40 miles per hour for 36 consecutive hours. When the storm broke, Helen checked both coops. In the bare coop, 4 chickens were dead. Frozen solid, their bodies stiff on the roost, their feathers rimed with ice that had formed from the moisture of their own breath, condensing on their plumage, then freezing. The surviving birds were clustered in the corner farthest from the north wall, pressed against each other in the desperate geometry of creatures seeking warmth from the only source available, which was each other. In the coop, wrapped with sunflower stalks, every chicken was alive. Not comfortable, not warm in any human sense of the word, but alive, moving their feathers, dry, their bodies displaying none of the rigid, huddled desperation that characterized the survivors in the bare coop. Helen opened the door of the wrapped coop, placed her hand against the interior surface of the north wall, felt something that surprised her. The wall was not warm, but it was not the killing cold she had felt in the bear coop. It was a different temperature entirely, a temperature that existed in a space between warm freezing, a temperature that the stalks had created by doing something to the wind, to the cold, to the relationship between the outside air, the wooden wall that Helen could feel but could not name. She did not need to name it. She needed to know it worked. It worked. Over the next 5 years, Helen refined the practice. She stacked sunflower stalks against the chicken coops every autumn. She expanded to the pig shelter. She built up the courage by the winter of 1878 to stack them against the south wall of the house itself, while Orrin was away for 3 days selling wheat in Wichita. When he returned, he looked at the stalks leaning against the house wall, looked at Helen, let out a long, slow exhale that carried the weight of a man who has learned that certain battles with his wife are not worth the energy they consume. He did not remove them. He did not approve of them. He simply let them stand the way a man lets a thing stand, when the effort of fighting it exceeds the effort of ignoring it. That winter, the south wall of the house was noticeably warmer than the other 3 walls. Helen could feel the difference with her hand. Orrin could feel it too, though he never acknowledged it, never commented on it, never connected the warmth of that wall to the ragged mass of dead sunflower stalks pressed against its exterior. He was not a man who revised his understanding of things. He was a man who maintained his understanding through the selective exclusion of evidence that contradicted it, a skill that required more energy than he probably realized, a skill that many people in the Beaverhead Valley would later demonstrate with equal commitment when confronted with the evidence of Nora's cabin. Helen taught Nora the practice the way all durable knowledge is transferred between mothers, daughters on a working farm, not through explanation, but through shared labor, through the annual repetition of a task performed together until the daughter's hands know the work before her mind can explain the reason. They cut sunflower stalks together in September. They bundled them together in October. They carried them to the walls of the coops, the shelter, eventually the house, stacking them together in a rhythm that required no conversation, no instruction, no theoretical framework, only the coordination of 2 bodies performing a task that one body had learned from observation, a neighboring woman's 9 words spoken across a fence. By the time Nora left Kansas for Montana, first to the Gallatin Valley with Thomas, then alone to the Beaverhead Valley after Thomas's death, the knowledge had settled so deeply into her body that it existed below the level of conscious thought. She did not think about sunflower insulation during her first 2 winters in Montana. She did not think about it because she was busy surviving by conventional methods, because conventional methods were what the situation seemed to demand, because the habit of conforming to local practice is strong in frontier communities, where deviation from the norm is not merely unusual, but potentially fatal. She chinked her walls with moss like everyone else. She stacked firewood against the north wall like everyone else. She burned fuel at the rate that the Montana winter demanded, which was a rate that consumed every cord she had split during the summer, left no margin for error, no reserve for the unexpected, no buffer between survival. The alternative: it was not until the second winter, the winter of Bess's fever, the winter when the north wall failed, the wind came through the chinking like a blade through cloth. The woodpile dwindled to half a cord. In February, her daughter lay shivering with a temperature that rose from the body's exhaustion rather than from any specific illness. It was not until that winter that the knowledge her mother had planted in her muscles rose to the surface of her mind. Summoned by desperation, the way water is summoned from a well, by the specific application of force to a pump handle. Don't fight the wind. Make the wind forget the wall. Her mother's voice speaking from the compost of memory, delivering the 9 words that Martha Yoder had spoken across a fence in Kansas 13 years earlier. Words that had traveled from one woman's mouth to another woman's hands, to a daughter's muscles to a cabin in Montana, where a child was sick because the wind could find the wall. By August of 1887, the sunflowers had reached their full height, which along the walls of Nora's cabin was something that altered the appearance of the structure so completely that a person seeing it for the first time would not have recognized it as a dwelling. The stalks grew 8 feet tall on the south wall, where sunlight was strongest, 9 feet on the east wall, where they caught the morning light, 7 on the north, where they received only reflected illumination from the sky. They were thick as broom handles at the base, tapering to a woody stem, the diameter of a finger at the top, leaning against the logs with the slow, heavy patience of living things that have grown too tall to support their own weight without assistance. The heads were enormous, 10 inches across on the smaller plants, 12 on the largest. the central disc packed with seeds arranged in the precise spiral pattern that sunflowers produce through a mathematical process that botanists would later describe using the Fibonacci sequence, but that the plants themselves accomplished without mathematics, without instruction, without anything except the genetic inheritance of a species that has been perfecting that spiral for longer than human beings have existed. They turned through the day to follow the sun. In the early morning, every head on the cabin's perimeter faced east, a silent congregation of gold-rimmed faces catching the first light. By midday, they had rotated to face south. By late afternoon, they looked west, their broad faces glowing in the angled light that turned the Montana sky the color of hammered copper. The cabin appeared to be surrounded by a crowd of tall, attentive figures, all facing the same direction, all moving in unison with a slowness that was imperceptible to anyone watching at any single moment, but undeniable over the course of an hour. The effect was strange, beautiful, vaguely unsettling, as if the flowers possessed a collective awareness that transcended the individual. Nobody in the valley saw insulation. They saw ornament. They saw a woman who had planted flowers around her cabin flowers that had grown into a spectacle, a curiosity, a conversation piece that drew riders off the road to stare. The beauty of the sunflowers confirmed for everyone who saw them the diagnosis that Harlan Bryce had already delivered at the trading post. This was decoration. Elaborate, labor-intensive, impressive in its scale, but decoration nonetheless. Nobody questioned the assumption because the assumption was invisible to the people who held it operating beneath their conscious awareness like a current beneath the surface of a river, shaping everything above it while remaining unseen. September came to the valley the way it always came. A sharpness in the morning air arriving overnight, as if someone had opened a door in the mountains, let something through that had been waiting on the other side since June. Cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow in a single week. Grass on the hills faded to the color of old rope. The sky, which in August had been a deep, generous blue that suggested permanence, thinned to a paler shade that suggested nothing of the kind. Nora's sunflowers began to die. They died the way sunflowers die standing up. The stalks dried from the base upward, the green leaching out of them over the course of days until they were the pale brown of cured tobacco. The heads drooped forward under the weight of their ripening seeds, bowing toward the ground, with the slow, dignified gravity of something completing its purpose. A field of dying sunflowers looks like a congregation at prayer. Every head lowered, every body still. The collective posture conveying a solemnity that has nothing to do with sorrow, everything to do with the simple biological fact of a cycle reaching its end. Nora harvested some seeds for replanting. She let the rest remain. She let the stalks stand where they had grown, pressed against the walls of her cabin, drying in the September air, that was itself drying, the humidity dropping as the temperature dropped, the atmosphere thinning toward the brittle clarity of autumn in the northern Rockies. Then she began to work. She started on the north wall. She gathered the dried stalks into bundles of 8 or 10, pulled them tight with lengths of cord she had prepared during the summer, binding them into dense cylindrical sheaves that she then pressed against the logs. She worked methodically. She placed each bundle vertically against the wall, the cut base resting on the ground, the dried head at the top, the hollow stem facing outward. She positioned them 2 inches from the log surface, maintaining the gap she had described to Harlan at the trading post, the gap that allowed air to circulate between the insulation layer, the wood preventing the moisture accumulation that Harlan had predicted. Between the bundles, the logs, she placed strips of dried cottonwood bark leaned at an angle that created tiny channels through which condensation could drain downward rather than pooling against the wood grain. She tied the bundles to each other using horizontal lengths of cord that ran around the entire perimeter of the cabin, cinching the sheaves together the way a cooper cinches staves around a barrel, creating a continuous band of dried vegetation that thickened as she added layer upon layer. The inner layer was stalks positioned vertically. The second layer was stalks positioned horizontally, their hollow centers creating thousands of tiny tubes through which air could not move, because the tubes were too small, too irregular, too densely packed to permit the kind of organized airflow that carries heat away from a surface. The third layer was the dried heads, broad, flat, fibrous discs, the size of dinner plates, pressed into the gaps between bundles like a mason, pressing stones into mortar, filling every space, eliminating every channel through which wind might penetrate to the layers beneath. She spent 2 weeks on the work. North wall first, then east, then south, then west. She left a narrow gap at the door just wide enough to enter. She left the stovepipe clear, trimming the stalks around it to prevent contact with the hot metal. Every other surface of the cabin, from foundation to eave, she covered in a dense packed layer of dead sunflower material that grew thicker with each pass until it reached a depth of nearly 3 feet on the north wall, 2 feet on the remaining three sides. When she finished, this cabin had vanished. A person passing on the road would have seen not a log structure, but a mound of dried brown plant matter, roughly rectangular with a stovepipe emerging from the top, trailing a thin line of smoke. It looked like neglect. It looked like a structure being slowly consumed by the land around it, the vegetation reclaiming what the axe had taken. The distinction between built environment, natural environment dissolving into a single mass of organic material that could have been a cabin or a haystack or a beaver lodge scaled up to human proportions. Harlan Bryce saw the finished work from the road one morning in early October. He did not stop. He slowed his horse to a walk, looked at the mound that had been Nora's cabin, let his jaw tighten with the controlled displeasure of a man watching a prediction come true. His son Edgar, riding beside him, looked too. Harlan spoke without turning his head. The flower cabin had become the dead flower cabin. Nora Whitfield would be pulling mice out of her walls by Christmas. Edgar did not respond. He was 14, old enough to notice things his father did not. Young enough to remain uncertain about whether his noticing constituted knowledge or merely confusion. He had been watching Nora's cabin since the sunflowers first appeared in June, watching with a quality of attention that was different from his father's, less diagnostic, more open, the kind of attention that does not begin with a conclusion. Work backward to find evidence that supports it. 3 days after his father's pronouncement about mice, Edgar rode to Nora's property alone. It was late afternoon, the light going amber, the air carrying the first real cold of the season. He did not knock on Nora's door. He did not announce himself. He simply dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post, walked to the north wall of the cabin, stood in front of the dense mass of dried sunflower stalks that covered the logs from ground to roofline. He reached out. He pressed his hand into the outer layer of the insulation, pushing past the dried heads, past the horizontal stalks, past the fibrous tangle of leaves that had dried into a brittle mat, the consistency of woven paper. His fingers penetrated 6 inches, 8 inches a foot into the material, before meeting resistance, the inner layer of vertical bundles that Nora had tied tight against the wall. He held his hand there inside the insulation 12 inches deep. The air around his fingers was still, not moving, not circulating, not doing anything at all. Outside the insulation, the October wind was blowing at 8 or 10 miles per hour from the northwest, steady enough to make the dried stalks on the outer surface rattle with a papery sound like shuffled cards. But inside at the depth where Edgar's hand rested, the wind did not exist. It had been broken by the outer layers, its force dispersed, scattered, turned against itself by the thousands of tiny obstructions that the tangled stalks presented, each hollow stem deflecting the airflow into a different direction, each deflection colliding with another, each collision converting organized wind into disorganized turbulence, until what reached the inner layers was not wind, but stillness. Edgar understood something at that moment, something he could not have put into words because the vocabulary he possessed did not include terms for thermal conductivity, windbreak dynamics, the insulative properties of dead airspace. He understood it the way a child understands that fire is hot, not through theory, but through the immediate sensory evidence of his own hand, inside a wall of dead flowers, feeling an absence of wind where wind should have been. Feeling the specific thermal condition that exists when moving air has been converted to still air inside a matrix of organic material that neither conducts heat nor permits convection. He pulled his hand out. He looked at the wall. He looked at the cabin that his father had dismissed, the dead flower cabin, the structure that the entire valley believed was an eccentric woman's folly, slowly decomposing into the landscape. He rode home. At supper, he mentioned to his father what he had felt. The air inside the stalks was completely still. No wind reached the inner layers. The material was dry despite having been rained on the previous week. Harlan listened with the patience of a father hearing a son report an observation that the father considers irrelevant. He chewed his food. He swallowed. Mice will nest in there before Christmas. He repeated, his voice carrying the tone of a man who has already reached his conclusion, who considers the subject closed, who does not recognize that his 14-year-old son has just performed with one outstretched hand the only experiment that the situation required. October deepened. The days shortened with a velocity that seemed to accelerate as the month progressed, each sunset arriving earlier than the last. Each sunrise later, the window of daylight narrowing like a door being slowly closed from both sides. Old Torsten Halverson, who had lived in the territory longer than anyone except the crow, began reading the signs the way he read them every year, with the practiced eye of a man who has survived more winters than he cares to count, by paying attention to the things that most people consider beneath their notice. The muskrat lodges along the creek were thicker than any year Halverson could remember. The animals had been building since August, plastering their dome-shaped homes with layer after layer of mud cattail stems, grass creating structures that rose 3 feet above the waterline, their walls so dense that a man could stand on them without breaking through. Muskrats built to match the winter they sensed coming. Thick lodges meant thick cold. Halverson had never known them to be wrong. The geese left early. The big flocks that usually passed over the valley in late October, their V formations drawing lines across the sky like cracks in gray porcelain, came through in the second week of the month, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, flying fast, flying high, not stopping to rest on the creek the way they did in mild years, when the water stayed open long enough to offer a surface worth landing on. The horses stood with their rumps to the northwest. This was the sign that Halverson trusted most, more than the muskrats, more than the geese, more than the thickness of the caterpillar fur, or the height of the hornet's nests, or any of the other folk indicators that frontier people cited with varying degrees of conviction. Horses knew. They felt the pressure changes in the atmosphere through sensors in their hooves, their sinuses, their skin, mechanisms that science had not yet identified, but that experience had confirmed through decades of observation. When the horses turned their hindquarters to the northwest, refused to be turned, stood facing southeast with their heads low, their tails clamped, their bodies braced against something that had not yet arrived, but that their biology could already feel approaching winter was going to be severe. Halverson told anyone who would listen. His voice was flat, uninflected, carrying neither drama nor urgency, because drama suggested uncertainty. Urgency suggested the possibility that preparation might be optional. His message was simple, delivered as measurement rather than prophecy. The winter of 1887 was going to be a killer. The October snows had come 3 weeks early. The ground froze in the first week of November, 2 weeks ahead of any year Halverson could remember. Creek ice was 4 inches thick before Thanksgiving. Every sign pointed in the same direction. Every sign spoke the same sentence. Prepare or suffer. The valley responded the way frontier communities always respond to the threat of extreme cold, with the organized urgency of people who understand that the margin between survival catastrophe is measured not in abstractions, but in cords of firewood, pounds of dried meat, inches of chinking, degrees of temperature that a cabin can maintain above the threshold where water freezes. Breath crystallizes, exposed skin dies. Firewood was split with a fury that filled the valley with the rhythmic percussion of axes biting into pine, the sound carrying for miles in the clear autumn air. Cabins were re-chinked with fresh moss pressed into clay that homesteaders mixed with straw for binding, working the material into every gap, every crack, every space between logs where the summer's heat had dried the previous year's seal into powder that crumbled at a touch. Draft animals were brought close, sheltered in lean-tos, reinforced with fresh-cut boughs. Root cellars were inventoried, counted, organized with the specificity of quartermasters preparing for a siege. Harlan Bryce spent the first 2 weeks of November splitting pine with a dedication that bordered on devotion. He split from dawn until the light failed, stacking the wood against the north wall of his cabin in cords that rose above the windowsill, each cord representing approximately 24 hours of continuous burning, at the rate his cast iron stove consumed fuel during the coldest nights. The wood served double duty. It was fuel reserve, the visible, countable, tangible evidence of his family's ability to outlast whatever the winter delivered, but it was also windbreak. A wall of stacked firewood 3 feet thick pressing against the north face of a cabin deflected a meaningful portion of the wind that would otherwise hit the logs, directly reducing heat loss by a margin that Harlan could feel, though he had never measured it. This was the standard practice. Every cabin in the valley displayed the same feature, the same wall of stacked pine rising against the north face, the same dual-purpose strategy that combined fuel storage with wind protection. It was effective. It had worked for 11 years. Harlan had no reason to question it, no incentive to consider alternatives, no framework for imagining that the woman who lived 300 yards east of him, the woman whose cabin was buried under a 3-foot layer of dead sunflower stalks, had arrived at a solution to the same problem that his solution addressed, but by a fundamentally different route. Nora split firewood too. She split less than Harlan because she could not swing an axe for 10 hours a day, because her frame was lighter, her endurance different, her body calibrated for a different kind of sustained effort. The effort of precise work rather than powerful work. The effort of fingers rather than shoulders. The effort of binding, weaving, positioning rather than chopping. She stacked her firewood inside the cabin, along the interior walls where it would serve as fuel but not as windbreak, because the exterior walls were already occupied. The sunflower stalks stood where she had bound them in September, dried now to the color of weathered bone, frozen by the November cold into a rigid mass that the first winds had compressed even tighter against the structure. Snow settled into the outer layer during the first week of November, filling the gaps between the outermost stalks, freezing into a crust that added another barrier. By mid-November, the cabin looked less like a mound of dead vegetation, more like a snowdrift that had formed around a shape buried inside it. The stovepipe rose from the top like the mast of a ship emerging from ice. Smoke trailed from it in a thin, steady line that suggested neither urgency nor abundance. Just the quiet, continuous burn of a stove, maintaining a temperature that required no heroic effort to sustain. The structure that Harlan Bryce had called the Deadflower Cabin was becoming something else. It was becoming a cabin wrapped in a cocoon of dead air, fibrous insulation, frozen moisture. A structure sheathed in material that functioned exactly the way a second wall would have functioned, blocking wind-trapping stillness, creating a thermal buffer between the interior, the exterior, except that it had cost nothing to build. It required no nails, no lumber, no labor beyond what one woman could accomplish with her hands, a length of cord, the seeds she had planted in May. It was the cheapest wall in the Beaverhead Valley, built from a crop that asked for nothing except dirt. Raintime built by a woman the valley considered otherwise sensible, maintained by the winter itself as snow ice pressure compressed the material into an ever denser shield against the cold that was coming. The blizzard arrived on the 14th of December. It came from the northwest, which was the direction blizzards always came from in that part of Montana, carried on the jet of Arctic air that descended through the gap between the Bitterroot Range to the west, the Pioneer Mountains to the east, channeled by the topography of the Beaverhead Valley, into a concentrated flow that hit the floor of the basin with a force multiplied by compression. But this blizzard came with a speed, a violence that even Torsten Halverson, who had been predicting a killer winter since October, had not fully anticipated. The temperature dropped 32 degrees in 4 hours. At 8 in the morning, the thermometer nailed to the post outside Halverson's cabin read 19 degrees Fahrenheit, cold, but manageable, the kind of cold that December delivered routinely, the kind that a well-chinked cabin with a working stove could handle without strain. By noon, the thermometer read -13. The drop was not gradual. It was not the slow, steady decline that characterizes most cold fronts. It fell in steps, each step a lurch downward that the body registered as a physical shock, as if the atmosphere were collapsing in stages, each stage removing another layer of the thermal protection that separated survivable cold from the kind of cold that kills tissue, freezes water in pipes, turns exposed metal into a surface that bonds with skin on contact. The wind swung north at 10 in the morning. It had been blowing from the west at 15 miles per hour through the early hours, a steady, unremarkable wind that carried the first snow of the storm in a conventional fall vertical, heavy, accumulating on the ground at a rate that suggested a routine December storm. When it swung north, it doubled. Then it doubled again. By noon, the wind was a sustained roar of 60 miles per hour, with gusts that Halverson later estimated at 70 or more. His estimate based not on instruments. He had none, but on the behavior of objects in his yard, the trajectory of debris, the particular pitch of the sound that wind makes when it exceeds the velocity at which it transitions, from a force you can lean into to a force that removes the choice of whether to stand or fall. The snow stopped falling. It started flying. Horizontal dents so thick that a person standing in it could not see their own outstretched hand, could not determine which direction was up, because the snow came from every direction, simultaneously driven from the north by the primary wind, deflected by structures, by terrain, by the turbulence of its own density, creating a chaos of white that obliterated all visual reference, all spatial orientation, all connection between the person standing in it, the world that had existed before the storm arrived. This was the kind of storm that did not simply challenge shelter. It tested the fundamental question of whether a given structure was shelter at all or merely an arrangement of materials waiting to be proved insufficient. It found every weakness in every cabin in the valley with the systematic thoroughness of an auditor examining books that have been kept carelessly for years. Every shortcut noted, every compromise exposed, every gap between intention, execution measured in the currency of cold air pouring through spaces that should have been sealed but were not. In Harlan Bryce's cabin, the wind found the chinking first. It found the places where the clay had dried during the autumn, contracted by the loss of moisture, leaving hairline fractures that were invisible from inside the cabin, but that the wind could detect with a precision that no human eye could match. The wind did not need to see the cracks, it felt them. It tested every inch of every wall with a pressure that was not random but systematic probing, searching for the point of failure the way water searches for the lowest point in a landscape. When it found a crack, it entered. Not as a draft, not as the gentle infiltration that homesteaders expected during routine winter weather. It entered as a blade, a focused stream of air at negative 13 degrees Fahrenheit, moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying a thermal load that could drop the temperature of an interior space by a degree per minute if the stream was wide enough. If the gap was large enough, if the stove could not produce heat fast enough to replace what the wind was stealing. Within 2 hours, the wind had found 3 gaps in Harlan's north wall. Within 4 hours, it had found the space beneath the door where the threshold log had warped over 11 seasons of freeze-thaw, the wood bowing imperceptibly upward. In summer, settling back in winter, each cycle widening the gap by a fraction of an inch until the gap was wide enough to admit a stream of air that spread across the floor like cold water. Within 6 hours, frost was forming on the interior walls. Not outside, inside. The moisture in the cabin air, the moisture from breathing from the pot of water on the stove, from the damp firewood stacked against the interior wall, was condensing on the log surfaces that had cooled below the dew point, freezing into a thin white film that spread across the wood grain with the slow, inexorable advance of something that cannot be stopped because its cause is not inside the cabin, but outside beyond the walls, beyond any barrier that Harlan had built. The temperature inside the cabin, which Harlan maintained with a cast iron stove burning continuously at maximum output, could not be raised above 41 degrees. He fed the stove with the desperate regularity of a man bailing water from a sinking boat, each load of pine disappearing into flame that produced heat that the walls surrendered before it could reach the far corners of the room. Ruth wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, placed them in the bed closest to the stove, told them to stay still because movement burned warmth, the way running burned breath, each gesture consuming calories that the body could not spare. The children lay rigid under the pile of quilts, their breath rising in visible plumes, their eyes open, watching the frost creep across the walls of the cabin their father had built with his own hands from logs he had selected, seasoned joined with the accumulated expertise of 11 Montana winters. The firewood stacked against the north wall outside was unreachable. Buried under 4 feet of driven snow, accessible only through a door that could not be opened against a wind that would have dropped the cabin's interior temperature by 10 degrees in the 30 seconds required to step outside, locate the woodpile, buy fuel extract, a load return. Harlan burned what he had inside. He calculated with the cold precision of a man who had counted cords every winter of his adult life that his interior supply would last 30 hours if he maintained the current rate. 30 hours. The storm showed no sign of breaking. 300 yards to the east inside the structure that the valley had been calling the Dead Flower Cabin since October. Nora Whitfield sat in a rocking chair near her stove, listening to the storm. She could hear it. The sound was immense, a roar that seemed to originate not from any specific direction, but from the sky itself, as if the atmosphere had developed a voice was using it to deliver a message whose content was indistinguishable from its volume. But the sound was muffled. It reached her through the log walls the way sound reaches a person underwater present, but dampened, stripped of its sharpness, robbed of the quality that makes a storm feel like it is happening to you rather than near you. The reason was outside, pressed against every wall in a band 3 feet thick. The sunflower stalks were taking the wind. They were taking it the way a breakwater takes a wave, not by resisting it with mass, but by disrupting it with structure. The wind hit the outer layer of dried stalks, broke, not stopped, broken. Its coherent force shattered into 1,000 small turbulences that turned collided canceled each other among the dense tangle of hollow stems, fibrous heads, frozen leaves. By the time what remained of the wind reached the log wall beneath, it was no longer wind in any meaningful sense. It was still air, motionless, disorganized, incapable of stripping heat from the surface it touched. Inside the cabin, the stove burned at the same modest rate Nora maintained on any winter evening. The temperature on the interior wall, the wall she could touch from her rocking chair, was cool, but not cold. No frost formed, no condensation gathered. The logs were dry to the touch because the moisture that the December air carried moisture that was freezing against every exposed log wall in the valley, expanding in the grain, cracking the chinking. Opening the gaps that the wind then exploited, that moisture had been intercepted by the dried sunflower material before it ever reached the wood. The stalks absorbed what was wet. They broke what was fast. Behind them, the cabin sat in a pocket of still dry air that the storm could not reach, like a stone at the bottom of a river, the current flowing over it, around it, past it, never touching the surface it protected. Bess sat on the floor near the stove reading a book. She was 10 years old. She was not wrapped in blankets. She was wearing a wool dress, stockings, her feet bare, where she had tucked them beneath her, the soles pink warm, exposed to the cabin air, with the casual indifference of a child who does not know that what she is experiencing is impossible. Bare feet in a cabin during a 60-mile-per-hour blizzard in December in Montana Territory. The fact of those bare feet, their warmth, their exposure, their effortless comfort in a room that should have been 41 degrees at best, that should have demanded every blanket in the house, that should have required the rigid, desperate stillness that Ruth Bryce had imposed on her children, 300 yards to the west, was a detail so quietly impossible that it would have stopped Harlan Bryce's breath if he had seen it. It would have stopped the breath of every man at the mill, every woman at the church social, every person in the Beaverhead Valley who had spent the summer calling this cabin a folly, its builder a fool, its sunflowers a waste of the only season that mattered. The wind screamed over the cabin, unable to find the wall beneath the flowers. The stove ticked along at its comfortable pace. Bess turned a page. Nora rocked in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the storm the way a person listens to rain on a roof, aware of it, respectful of it, unthreatened by it, separated from it by a barrier that the rain cannot cross. A barrier built not from strength but from stillness, not from resistance but from the quiet refusal to let the wind remember where the wall was. Outside, the blizzard continued to build. It would last 2 more days. It would bury the valley under 3 feet of snow. It would kill 14 head of cattle on the Bryce property alone. It would crack walls, split chinking exhaust fuel supplies, test every cabin in the region against the question that all shelters must eventually answer. Are you sufficient, or are you merely standing? Inside the dead flower cabin, a girl read her book with bare feet, the quietest proof that ever answered a valley full of doubt. The blizzard broke on the morning of December 16th. It did not taper off. It did not soften into the gradual diminuendo that most storms follow as they exhaust themselves. It stopped. Between 1 hour the next, the wind dropped from 60 miles per hour to nothing, as if someone had thrown a lever that controlled the atmosphere, shut it down with the mechanical finality of a machine being turned off. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence that exists only in the aftermath of sustained violence. A silence so complete that it seemed to have weight, substance, presence, occupying the space the storm had vacated. The way water fills a hole dug in wet sand, instantly, totally, without leaving room for anything else. The valley lay buried. 3 feet of snow on level ground, drifts reaching 8 feet against north-facing walls, 10 feet in the draws between hills, where the wind had channeled the driven snow into deposits so deep that fence posts vanished beneath them, their locations marked only by the slight depression in the surface where the post had disrupted the smooth accumulation. The creek was invisible, its course indicated by a shallow trough in the snowfield where the water's residual warmth had melted a fraction of an inch more than the surrounding ground before the cold overwhelmed even that modest advantage. Trees along the creek bank stood glazed in ice, their branches encased in a crystalline shell that caught the morning light, broke it into prisms that scattered across the white landscape in brief flashes of color that seemed too delicate to belong to the same world that had produced the storm. Harlan Bryce dug out his door with a shovel that had been inside the cabin, propped against the wall next to the stove, placed there as a matter of routine every autumn. Because a man who had survived 11 Montana winters understood that the ability to exit your own home after a blizzard was not guaranteed but prepared for. The snow against his door was 4 feet deep, packed by the wind into a density that resisted the shovel blade with the stubbornness of wet clay. He carved a trench through it, throwing each shovelful to the side with the mechanical rhythm of a man performing labor that his body knows so well it no longer requires the participation of his mind. When he broke through to daylight, the cold hit his face with a sharpness that made his eyes water immediately, the tears freezing on his cheeks before they could reach his jawline. The thermometer on the post read negative 21 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that follows extreme wind, the way exhaustion follows extreme effort. The atmosphere depleted, emptied, incapable of movement. He stood in the trench he had dug his head above the snow surface, his body below it looking at a landscape he had known for 11 years but did not recognize. His north wall was destroyed. Not collapsed, the logs themselves remained standing, the structure intact, but the defensive integrity of the wall had been comprehensively breached. The chinking was gone from 3 of the gaps between logs. Not cracked, not loosened. Gone. Pulled out by the wind's force, the clay extracted from the joints the way a dentist extracts a filling, cleanly, completely leaving openings through which Harlan could see the interior of his own cabin. Daylight entered through those gaps and shafts that fell across the floor with the sharp-edged clarity of light entering through deliberate windows rather than accidental holes. He could see his stove from outside. He could see Ruth's rocking chair. He could see the bed where his children had spent 2 days shivering under every blanket the family owned. The firewood stack against the north wall was a buried ridge of snow. 2 days of excavation minimum before he could reach the first cord. He had burned through 3/4 of his interior reserve during the storm. What remained was a quarter cord stacked against the interior south wall, enough for perhaps 36 hours of burning at the rate the stove demanded in this cold. 36 hours was not a crisis. 36 hours was a margin thin but navigable, provided no second storm arrived before he could dig out the exterior supply. He had survived. His family had survived. Ruth was inside, already heating water for coffee, already performing the small rituals of normalcy that a woman performs after a crisis. Not because the crisis is over, but because the rituals are necessary, because the act of making coffee in a cabin with daylight coming through holes in the wall is an assertion that the wall will be repaired, the holes will be filled, the routine will resume, the family will continue. But Harlan knew how close it had been. He knew because he had counted the fuel as it burned log by log through 2 days of continuous firing. He knew because he had felt the frost forming on the walls he had built, had watched it spread across the wood grain with a patience that mocked his efforts to stop it. He knew because his children had been cold, not uncomfortable, not chilled, cold in the way that precedes damage, the way that a body begins to surrender the fight to maintain its core temperature. The extremities going first, the fingers, the toes, the ears cooling toward the threshold where tissue death begins. His daughter Mary's fingers had been white at the tips on the second morning. Ruth had rubbed them between her own hands for 20 minutes before the color returned. 20 minutes of rubbing a 9-year-old's fingertips while frost covered the walls of the cabin her father had built. That memory would stay with him. Not as a story he would tell, because Harlan Bryce was not a man who told stories about his own failures. It would stay as a sensation, the feeling of his daughter's cold fingers in his wife's hands, the visible evidence that his preparation had been insufficient, that his 11 years of experience had produced a cabin that could not protect a child's fingers from the cold, that a 60-mile-per-hour wind drove through gaps in clay, chinking that he had applied the previous September, with the confidence of a man who believed he knew everything a wall needed to hold. He walked his property that morning, 14 head of cattle dead, frozen in the field where the storm had caught them, their bodies dusted with snow, their legs locked in the positions they had held when the cold stopped their hearts. Some had drifted against the fence clustered in the corner, where 2 fence lines met, pressing against each other in the final desperate attempt to share warmth that was no longer being produced. Their hides were stiff, their eyes were open, glazed with ice that gave them the appearance of glass ornaments rather than animals that had been alive 48 hours earlier. He counted them without emotion. Emotion was not useful. 14 head represented approximately $400 in loss value, which represented approximately 1/3 of his herd, which represented approximately 6 months of income that would need to be replaced through increased production from the surviving animals or through the purchase of replacement stock in the spring, which would require capital that would need to come from somewhere. The somewhere being the grain reserves he had been planning to sell at the Dillon Depot in March. The arithmetic of loss reorganized his entire spring before the snow had finished settling. He spent the rest of the day digging. He dug the path to the outhouse. He dug the path to the barn. He began excavating the north wall firewood stack, a project that would take 2 full days of labor and cold that never rose above zero. Ruth re-chinked the 3 open gaps from inside the cabin, using a mixture of flour paste, fabric scraps, any material she could find that would fill the spaces, until Harlan could apply a proper clay repair in the spring. The patches were ugly improvised, visible evidence of emergency rather than maintenance. They held. They reduced the drafts to a level that the stove could manage. The temperature inside the cabin rose from 41 degrees to 53, which was not comfortable but was survivable, was sufficient, was enough to unclench the fists that had been closed for 2 days, to release the jaw muscles that had been locked against the shivering, to allow the children to move from the bed to the table, to eat, to speak, to resume the small transactions of daily life that cold suspends the way ice suspends a stream. On the morning of December 17th, Harlan walked to Nora Whitfield's property. He told himself he was checking on her the way any neighbor would check on a widow after a storm of that magnitude, performing the baseline obligation of frontier community. The obligation that required a man to verify that the people around him had survived before he returned to the business of his own survival. That was what he told himself. What drove him was something else, something he would not have named, because naming it would have required him to acknowledge its existence, which would have required him to acknowledge that his understanding of cabins' walls, insulation, the entire architecture of winter survival might contain a gap as significant as the gaps the wind had found in his chinking. He was curious, not casually curious, not idly wondering, but curious in the specific way that a man becomes curious when his own methods have been tested, found insufficient, his confidence shaken by the physical evidence of his children's cold hands, his frost-covered walls, his inadequate fuel supply. He was curious about the woman who had spent the summer doing something he had publicly declared foolish, the woman whose cabin he had publicly predicted would fail, the woman whose methods he had dismissed at the trading post in front of witnesses with the calm authority of a man who understood wood weather, the fundamental engineering of survival in a country that killed without preference. He expected damage. He expected the sunflower stalks to have been torn away by the wind, scattered across the frozen landscape in a debris field of shredded vegetation. The elaborate insulation system stripped from the walls, the way wallpaper is stripped from plaster. The brittle dried material no match for the sustained force of a 60-mile-per-hour wind carrying particles of ice that sandblasted every exposed surface in the valley. He expected to find a cabin laid bare, its logs cracked, its chinking destroyed, the eccentric experiment of the summer revealed as the folly the community had always believed it to be. He expected in some part of himself that he would not have admitted to find confirmation. Confirmation that his methods were correct. Confirmation that the standard practices of 11 years were sufficient. Confirmation that the woman who had quietly challenged those practices by doing something different had been wrong. That his public assessment at the trading post had been accurate. That wood did wick moisture through 2 inches of air, that the sunflowers had caused the damage he had predicted. That the natural order of things, his expertise, her inexperience, his knowledge, her intuition, his authority, her silence remained intact. What he found stopped him at the fence line. The cabin was still wrapped. The sunflower stalks were still in place. Not all of them. The outermost layer on the north face had been stripped, the top foot or so sheared away by the wind's peak force. The brittle dried heads torn loose, scattered across the snow in a trail of debris that extended 20 yards downwind. But beneath that sacrificial outer layer, the dense, packed core of the insulation remained intact. The bundles Nora had tied in September held against the logs, frozen solid, compressed by the storm's pressure into a mass so dense it looked less like plant material than like a natural feature of the terrain, a geological deposit rather than a constructed barrier. Snow had drifted against the insulation during the blizzard, accumulating in a slope that rose from ground level to the eave line, adding yet another layer of protection. The cabin looked like a snow-covered hill with a stovepipe. It looked like something that had been there for 100 years. Something the land had grown over, absorbed into itself, claimed as part of the topography. It did not look like a structure. It did not look like a building. It looked like the valley had decided to protect it, had drawn a blanket of snow over it, the way a mother draws a blanket over a sleeping child, covering it completely, leaving only the stovepipe exposed so it could breathe. Smoke rose from that stovepipe. Thin smoke. Calm smoke. Not the thick, desperate column that a stove produces when it is being driven at maximum capacity against cold that exceeds its ability to compensate. This was the smoke of a fire burning at a moderate sustainable rate, the smoke of a household that was warm enough, a stove that was not struggling a fuel supply, that was not being consumed with the frantic urgency that Harlan had experienced for 2 days in his own cabin. He stood at the fence looking at that smoke, the way a man looks at evidence that contradicts everything he has believed, everything he has said publicly, everything his experience has taught him to expect. He walked closer. The snow was deep enough that each step required him to lift his leg above the surface plant. It compress a new footprint, repeat. The effort warmed him. The cold tried to take the warmth back. This exchange effort, producing heat-cold, reclaiming it, was the fundamental transaction of winter in Montana, the transaction that every living thing in the territory conducted continuously from November through March, the transaction that the sunflower stalks had somehow interrupted on behalf of the cabin they surrounded. He reached the door. The gap Nora had left in the insulation was partially blocked by drifted snow, but the door itself was clear. The overhang of the eave, combined with the depth of the insulation layer, had created a sheltered alcove in front of the entrance, where the wind could not deposit its load. He knocked. The sound of his knuckles against the wood was dull, muffled, absorbed by the mass of dried vegetation pressing against the walls on either side of the doorframe. Nora opened the door. The air that came through the opening hit Harlan's face with a force that was not physical, but thermal. A wave of warmth so unexpected, so incongruous with everything the last 48 hours had established about what was possible inside a log cabin in December in Montana, that he took half a step backward before he could stop himself. The air was warm, not survivable, not the grim 41 degrees he had maintained in his own cabin through continuous maximum burning. Warm, soft, dry. The air of a heated room, a comfortable room, a room whose relationship to the storm outside was not adversarial, but indifferent, as if the blizzard had been a minor event occurring at a great distance, rather than a sustained assault on the structure's ability to exist. He looked past Nora into the cabin. Bess was sitting at the table eating porridge. The girl wore a cotton dress. Her hair was braided. She looked up at Harlan with the unconcerned expression of a child whose experience of the blizzard had been 2 days of reading, sleeping, eating, in a room where the temperature never required her to put on a second layer of clothing. There was no urgency in her posture, no residual tension in her body. None of the tight-shouldered hunching that Harlan's own children still displayed the physical memory of cold stored in their muscles, even now that the storm had passed. He stepped inside. He looked at the walls. The interior surfaces of the logs were dry. Not damp, not sweating with condensation, not coated in the thin film of frost that had covered every wall in his own cabin for 2 days. Dry. The grain of the wood was visible, the natural color of seasoned pine, unmarked by moisture, unstained by the freezing thawing cycle that left dark watermarks on every log wall in the valley after a major storm. He looked at the stove. It was burning at a rate he would have described as lazy, a low, steady combustion that produced enough heat to warm a cabin in October, but that should have been wildly insufficient for December, for a blizzard, for the conditions that had driven him to burn through 3/4 of his fuel reserve in 48 hours. He looked at the woodpile stacked against the interior south wall. It was barely diminished. 2 days of burning through the worst storm in Harlan's memory, the fire had consumed what appeared to be a single day's worth of fuel under normal winter conditions. The math did not work. The math could not work according to everything Harlan understood about heat loss, fuel consumption, the thermal behavior of log walls exposed to extreme wind at extreme temperatures. The math required a variable he had not included in his calculations, a factor that existed outside his experience, outside his model of how cabins functioned, outside the 11-year accumulation of knowledge that he had believed was comprehensive. He reached out. He laid his palm flat against the interior surface of the nearest log wall. The north wall, the wall that faced the worst of the wind, the wall whose exterior surface was buried under 3 feet of dried sunflower stalks. Snow ice, the wall was warm, not heated, not radiating. Warm the way a wall is warm in a home where the insulation is working, where the barrier between exterior is functioning at a level that prevents the outside temperature from reaching the inside surface, where the logs are holding their temperature because nothing on the other side is pulling it away. He held his hand there for a long moment. He felt the warmth against his palm. He felt the smoothness of the dry wood. He felt the absence of frost condensation moisture, all the symptoms of a wall losing its battle with winter. He felt through the surface of that log the presence of something on the other side that was not wind, not cold, not the killing environment that existed 3 feet beyond the sunflower stalks. He felt still air. He could not see it, could not measure it, could not have described it in terms that would have satisfied a physicist or an engineer. But he felt it the way a person feels the difference between a room with a fire burning, a room where the fire has just gone out, not through temperature alone, but through the quality of the air, its weight, its texture, the way it sits against the skin without pulling, without taking, without demanding the constant production of heat to replace what is being lost. He pulled his hand back slowly. He looked at Nora. She was standing near the stove, neither expectant nor defensive, her face displaying the particular neutrality of a woman who has nothing to prove, because the proof is in the wall, in the stove, in the woodpile, in her daughter's bare feet, in the warm, dry air that is touching the face of the man who called her cabin foolish. He did not say anything about the sunflowers being a waste. He did not say anything about rot mice vanity, the word otherwise. He did not repeat his prediction about 5 winners. He did not reference the trading post conversation, the public assessment, the confident diagnosis of moisture damage that he had delivered in front of witnesses who were at this moment digging out their own frozen cabins across the valley. His voice came low, stripped of the authority he had carried for 11 years carrying. Instead, the raw weight of a man confronting the distance between what he had believed what was true. I was wrong. 3 words, delivered the way a man delivers a confession that costs him something real. Something he cannot get back, the particular currency of pride that accumulates over years of being right, often enough to believe you are always right. Spent in a single sentence, standing in a warm cabin that his expertise had declared impossible. Nora heard the words. She did not react visibly. She did not display satisfaction, vindication, the triumph of a woman proved right after months of public dismissal. She turned to the stove, poured coffee from the pot that had been warming there since morning, handed the cup to Harlan without ceremony, without commentary, without the need to add words to a moment that words would have diminished. She had never told him so because she had never told him anything. She had planted. She had grown. She had dried. She had bound. She had waited for the only argument that mattered, which was not an argument at all, but a season. Harlan drank the coffee. It was hot, strong, brewed with the economy of a woman who measured coffee the way she measured everything, precisely, without waste. He drank it standing in the middle of a warm cabin during the coldest week in Montana memory, surrounded by walls that should have been frozen, holding a cup that should have been the only warm thing in the room. Understanding with each sip that the woman who had given it to him knew something. He did not had always known it. Had tried to explain it exactly once at the trading post with a description of 2 inches of air strips of cottonwood bark, a system he had dismissed because it did not fit the shape of what he already understood. He finished the coffee. He thanked her. He walked home through the snow 300 yards that took him 15 minutes because the drifts were deep. His legs heavy, his mind occupied with the particular labor of a man rebuilding a model of the world that has just been proved incomplete. He did not speak to Ruth about what he had seen when he arrived home. He sat at his own table in his own cabin with the improvised chinking patches visible on the north wall, the memory of frost spreading across those walls still fresh. His daughter Mary's white fingertips still vivid in his mind, his remaining quarter cord of firewood stacked against the south wall like a rebuke. He sat for a long time. Then he began planning for the next summer. The following spring, when the snow receded from the Beaverhead Valley in the slow, reluctant retreat that characterized every Montana thaw, revealing the damage the winter had done, the fences broken, the roofs sagged, the dead livestock still frozen in the fields where the April sun had not yet reached Harlan. Bryce did something he had never done in 11 years of homesteading. He asked a neighbor for instruction. He walked to Nora's property on an afternoon in late March, the ground still frozen beneath a thin skin of mud, the air carrying the first suggestion of warmth that had existed in the valley since October. He stood at her fence. He did not call across to her the way he had the previous May, when he had asked what the sunflowers were for, received the 3-word answer that he had spent the intervening 10 months failing to understand. He walked through the gate, crossed her yard, knocked on her door, stood before her with his hat in his hands, the posture of a man who has come not to advise, but to learn. He asked her to teach him. He used that word, teach. A word that Harlan Bryce had never directed at another adult in his life, a word that required him to position himself as the student, the unknowing, the person whose expertise was insufficient, whose 11 years of experience had produced a cabin that nearly killed his family, while a woman with 3 years in the valley had built one that kept her daughter's feet warm during the worst storm in territorial memory. Nora looked at him for a moment. Whatever she saw in his face, the sincerity, the difficulty, the cost of what he was asking, she accepted it without making him pay more than the asking had already cost. She stepped outside. She walked to the north wall of her cabin, where the sunflower insulation still clung to the logs, battered by the winter. The outer layers shredded the inner layers, compressed, frozen, stained with snowmelt, but fundamentally intact. Still performing the function it had been built to perform, even as the season that required it drew to a close. She showed him. She pulled back a section of the outer layer, exposed the bundled stalks beneath, pointed to the 2-inch gap between the insulation, the logs, the strips of cottonwood bark that maintained the air channel. She explained in more words than she had ever used with him what each layer did. The outer layer took the damaged wind ice debris so the inner layers didn't have to. The middle layers broke the wind by presenting thousands of surfaces that deflected airflow into chaos. The inner layer, tight against the gap, held still air against the wall surface. The bark strips kept moisture draining downward instead of pooling against the grain. Harlan listened with the concentration of a man hearing something for the first time that he should have been hearing for years. He asked questions she had never been asked. How thick does the layer need to be on the north wall compared to the south? Whether the heads should be left attached or removed? How to handle the stalks on the south wall, where winter sun exposure could cause thaw-freeze cycling that might degrade the binding? Whether the cord used for tying should be natural fiber, which would rot, or treated, which would last but might introduce chemicals that attracted insects. Nora answered every question with the patient specificity of someone explaining something she had done with her hands so many times that the knowledge lived in her muscles rather than her memory. 3 feet on the north wall, 2 on the others. Heads left attached, they filled gaps, added density, provided additional wind resistance. South wall stalks bound tighter because the freeze-thaw cycle would loosen them if they had any slack. Natural cord, replaced annually, the labor of replacing was less than the risk of chemical treatment. She answered without condescension. She answered without referencing the months of mockery, the name flower cabin, the public assessment at the trading post, the word otherwise that had traveled through the valley like a verdict. She answered the way her mother had answered her own questions decades earlier in Kansas, with the practical directness of a woman sharing useful knowledge. Because useful knowledge shared is useful knowledge multiplied. Because the survival of the valley was not a competition between her methods, his methods, but a collective enterprise that benefited when every cabin was stronger, every wall better protected, every family warmer. Harlan planted his sunflowers in April, 3 weeks before Nora planted hers. He planted them the way he did everything, with the thoroughness of a man who, once committed, does not commit halfway. He prepared the soil along all 4 walls of his cabin, scraped trenches at the precise distance from the foundation that Nora had specified, placed the seeds at the spacing she had recommended, watered them from the creek with a diligence that his wheat crop rarely received. Ruth watched him from the porch with an expression that contained equal parts surprise, relief. The quiet satisfaction of a woman who had known before her husband knew that the flower cabin was not what any of them had thought. 2 other families planted that spring. The Halverson family, whose patriarch had predicted the killer winter, recognized in Nora's method a solution to the problem he had been forecasting for decades. A younger family, the Duncans, who had arrived in the valley in 1886 with an infant son, nearly lost the child during the blizzard when their cabin's single room could not be heated above 38 degrees. Planted sunflowers around their cabin with the desperate urgency of people for whom the memory of a baby's blue lips was still raw enough to override any concern about what the neighbors might think. The name changed. Through the spring of 1888, the phrase flower cabin disappeared from the vocabulary of the valley, replaced gradually, unconsciously, by a different term that carried a different inflection. Flower wall. The distinction was not semantic. Flower cabin had been a joke, the emphasis falling on the word flower to highlight the absurdity of treating a survival structure as a garden. Flower wall was a description, the emphasis falling on wall to acknowledge that the flowers served a structural purpose, that the boundary between decoration defense had been erased by a winter that proved them the same thing. The summer of 1888 passed. The sunflowers grew along the walls of 4 cabins instead of one. By August, the Bryce cabin had vanished behind a wall of gold, the way Nora's had the previous year, the tall stalks leaning against the logs, the broad heads turning through the day to follow the sun. Harlan stood in his own yard looking at his own cabin, disappearing behind the flowers he had planted on the instructions of the woman he had publicly corrected, privately doubted, eventually sought out with his hat in his hands asking to be taught. The feeling that accompanied this vision was complex, layered, impossible to reduce to a single emotion. Pride in having recognized his error, shame at having made it publicly, gratitude toward a woman who had responded to his mockery with coffee rather than retribution. Respect for a form of knowledge that his own experience had not contained, could not have contained, because it came from a different place. Traveled through different hands, arrived at the same problem from a direction he had never faced. Edgar Bryce, now 15, took charge of his family's flower wall that autumn. He cut the stalks. He bundled them. He bound them against the logs with the same technique Nora had demonstrated to his father in March. But Edgar had also gone to Nora directly separately from his father's visits, appearing at her property on an October afternoon with the straightforward request of a boy who wanted to understand not just what to do, but why it worked. His question was not the question his father had asked. Harlan had asked how. Edgar asked what happens to the wind. Nora looked at the boy, recognized in his question the same quality of practical curiosity that she had inherited from her mother, that her mother had carried from a fence-line conversation with Martha Yoder in Kansas, that Martha had carried from a tradition of agricultural knowledge refined across generations of farming harsh climates. The quality was not intelligence exactly, not education certainly, but something more durable than either the willingness to observe without prejudging, to store what was seen without requiring immediate explanation, to let the observation sit until circumstances revealed its value. She took him to the north wall, pulled back the outer layer of dried stalks, told him to put his hand inside. He already knew what he would feel. He had done it the previous October, the unauthorized visit that had produced the observation his father dismissed. But this time he felt it with comprehension rather than mere sensation. Nora explained it not with science but with imagery. The wind was like water in a river, she told him, strong when it flowed in one direction, harmless when it was broken into drops. The stalks broke the river into drops. By the time the drops reached the wall, they had forgotten which direction they had been flowing, forgotten they had been a river at all. They were just air sitting still, going nowhere, holding whatever temperature they held. Edgar carried that image with him the way Nora's mother had carried Martha Yoder's 9 words. He carried it into the winter of 1888 to 1889, which was not as severe as the blizzard winter, but was harsh enough to test every cabin in the valley against the standard that winter always imposed. The cabins with flower walls held, all 4 of them. The Bryce cabin, wrapped in Harlan's first crop of dried sunflower stalks, maintained an interior temperature that never dropped below 55 degrees, even during the coldest week of January when the mercury fell to -17. The wind blew at 35 miles per hour for 3 consecutive days. Harlan's fuel consumption dropped by nearly a third compared to the previous year. His chinking survived intact. His walls stayed dry. He stood in his cabin during that January cold snap, his palm pressed against the north wall, feeling the warmth that the wall held, the warmth that the dried sunflower stalks outside were keeping from escaping. He understood something in that moment that the first winter, the winter of proof, had not fully taught him. The value of what Nora had built was not in the crisis it survived, but in the ordinary winters it made easier. The blizzard of '87 had been the dramatic test, the event that forced him to confront his error, the moment of conversion. But the true measure of the method was not whether it could withstand the worst storm in memory. The true measure was whether it could make a normal winter less costly, less dangerous, less consuming of the fuel, the effort, the constant vigilance that Montana demanded from every person who chose to live within reach of its weather. The flower wall did not just protect against catastrophe. It reduced the daily tax that winter levied on every homestead in the valley, the steady drain of heat fuel energy that accumulated over 5 months into a deficit that could break a family even in a year without a single memorable storm. The second winter's quiet success mattered more than the first winter's dramatic survival. The first winter made people believe. The second winter made the practice disappear into the routine of daily life, becoming invisible the way all truly successful methods eventually become invisible, absorbed into the texture of normal behavior performed without discussion, without justification, without the need for the dramatic proof that had been required to establish them. In the spring of 1890, a government surveyor named Marsh passed through the Beaverhead Valley on a mapping expedition that was documenting homestead improvements throughout southwestern Montana. His field journal, a leather-bound notebook filled with the cramped, precise handwriting of a man trained to record observations without editorializing them, contained an entry dated April 14, 1890, that noted a distinctive feature he had not encountered in any other region of the territory. Several homesteads in the Beaverhead region, the entry read, displayed a construction practice involving dense plantings of dried sunflower stalks bound against the exterior walls of log cabins in thick mats that gave the structures the appearance of haystacks with chimneys. The mats appeared to serve an insulative function, residents reporting significantly reduced fuel consumption during winter months. The practice was attributed to a homesteader whose name Marsh recorded as Mrs. N. Whitfield of Dillon. Mrs. N. Whitfield of Dillon. The name written in a government surveyor's field journal recorded in the same neutral handwriting that documented creek elevations, soil compositions, fence line distances. Not the flower cabin, not the dead flower cabin, not the otherwise sensible woman whose eccentricity had amused a valley for a summer. A name and an official record attached to a practice that worked, attributed to a woman whose contribution to the community's survival was now documented in the same category as the geography of the land itself. The practice continued to spread. By 1893, Nora counted 11 homesteads in the Beaverhead Valley using flower walls. By 1895, travelers from the neighboring Ruby Valley reported seeing the technique on homesteads east of the Divide. The knowledge moved the way all practical knowledge moves in frontier communities, not through publication, not through formal instruction, but through the slow lateral transmission of neighbor teaching. Neighbor. Each household adapting the method to its specific circumstances. Each adaptation producing a variation that was slightly different from the original, but functionally identical, each variation proving itself through the winter that tested it. Nora's mother, Helen Pratt, died in the spring of 1891. She died in Kansas, in the house she had shared with Orrin for 40 years, the south wall of which still bore the faint discoloration where decades of sunflower stalks had been stacked against the exterior surface each autumn. She died without knowing that the practice she had learned from Martha Yoder across a fence in 1874 had traveled to Montana, had survived a blizzard, had changed the way an entire valley built its homes. She died the way most carriers of practical knowledge die, without recognition, without documentation, without any awareness that the things she had passed to her daughter through years of shared labor had become something larger than either of them had intended. Nora received the news by letter 3 weeks after the burial. She read the letter at her table in the cabin whose walls were still wrapped in the dried remnants of the previous autumn's sunflowers, the cabin that her mother's knowledge had made warm. She folded the letter into the family Bible next to the coroner's report for Thomas. She did not cry. She went outside, walked to the north wall, placed her hand against the dried stalks, the way a person places their hand against a surface that connects them to someone who is no longer reachable by any other means. The stalks were dry, papery, warm in the April sun. They felt like what they were, the physical residue of a practice that her mother had given her, the last useful thing Helen Pratt had passed from her own hands into her daughter's, the gift that kept a child's feet warm in a Montana blizzard. The answer to a question that Martha Yoder had answered with 9 words across a fence in Kansas. Harlan Bryce died in 1909, 22 years after the blizzard that had changed his mind. He died in early March of pneumonia in the cabin he had built with his own hands, the cabin whose north wall had failed during the storm of '87, the cabin that had been wrapped in flower walls for 21 consecutive winters since. He died warm. The sunflower stalks were pressed against the exterior walls at the time of his death, the winter's accumulation of snow ice, frozen vegetation forming the cocoon that had become as much a part of the structure as the logs themselves. The stove was burning at its moderate rate. Ruth was beside him. The cabin was holding its temperature the way it had held it every winter since the summer Harlan had walked to Nora's property with his hat in his hands. His son Edgar maintained the flower walls without being asked. By 1909, the practice required no instruction, no justification, no explanation. It was what you did. You grew sunflowers against your walls, the way you split firewood, the way you banked your foundation, the way you performed all the small, essential rituals that separated a homestead that survived from a homestead that did not. The practice had completed the journey that all genuinely useful ideas complete. The journey from eccentric to controversial to accepted to invisible, each stage shorter than the last. The final stage, invisibility, being the mark of true success, the point at which a practice is so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of daily life that no one remembers it was ever questioned. In the summer of 1910, a year after Harlan's death, Edgar stood at the fence line of his property, watching his daughter, 8 years old, kneeling in the dirt along the north wall of the cabin. She was pressing sunflower seeds into the soil with the pad of her thumb, one after another, spacing them 4 inches apart, working along the base of the wall with the patient rhythm of someone performing a task she had learned by watching rather than by being told. Her hands were black to the wrists. Her dress was dusty at the knees. She worked without looking up, without asking for guidance, without needing to be told what she was doing or why. Edgar watched her from the fence. He did not walk over. He did not offer instruction. He did not tell her the story of Nora Whitfield, the flower cabin, the blizzard of '87, his father's frozen walls, the warm coffee in the warm room, the barefoot girl reading a book while the wind tried to kill everything it could reach. He did not tell her because the story was not the point. The point was the knowledge in her hands, the knowledge that had traveled from Martha Yoder to Helen Pratt, to Nora Whitfield, to Harlan Bryce, to Edgar himself, to this girl, this child kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into the ground against the wall of a cabin that would be warm in December because of what she was doing right now in June. The chain of hands unbroken, the practice alive, the wind already somewhere beyond the mountains gathering itself for the winter that was always coming. She did not know who Martha Yoder was. She did not know about the root cellar in Kansas, the fence line conversation, the 9 words spoken in limited English that had started everything. She did not know the science of dead air spaces, thermal conductivity, the insulative properties of hollow plant stems, arranged in a matrix dense enough to convert organized wind into harmless stillness. She did not know any of the history, any of the theory, any of the arguments that had surrounded the practice during the single summer when it had been controversial. She only knew that this was what you did. You planted sunflowers against your walls. Your mother did it. Your grandmother did it. The woman down the road who had started it all, the woman whose cabin had been warm when everyone else's was cold, she did it. You did it because it worked, because the people you trusted did it, because the knowledge was in your hands. Now placed there by other hands, carried forward by the simple act of kneeling in the dirt, each spring pressing seeds into the soil, waiting for the growing, the dying, the binding, the covering, the long white silence of winter during which the walls held, because the flowers held, because the air was still, because the wind that always came, could never find the wall. Edgar's daughter pressed another seed into the dirt. The sun was warm on her back. The earth was cool under her knees. Somewhere beyond the mountains to the north, a weather system was forming that would not arrive for 6 months, that would test every wall in the valley, the way every winter tested every wall, without malice, without mercy, without any interest in the story of how the walls came to be built the way they were built. The system did not care about Nora Whitfield. It did not care about flower walls. It did not care about the 9 words Martha Yoder had spoken to Helen Pratt across a fence in Kansas in 1874. It cared only about the gap between warm-cold, the eternal negotiation between shelter exposure, the question that every structure answers every winter, are you sufficient? The girl pressed another seed into the dirt. The wall would be sufficient. The knowledge in her hands would see to that, the knowledge that had never been written down, never been published, never been taught in any school, never been validated by any authority except the authority of winter itself, which was the only authority that mattered, which had tested the knowledge every year for 36 years, which had never found it wanting. The wind always comes. It always comes.